Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of I Walked with Giants, Jimmy Heath.
Jimmy Heath, you've written your autobiography called I Walked with Giants. If someone's watching this and they don't know anything about you, what should they know?
That I've been a musician for 60 or 70 years, and a lot of the great performers that they do know are friends of mine, and they are the giants that I've walked with.
What kind of music do you play?
I'm a jazz musician. That's African-American classical music, if you prefer.
What's your instrument?
I'm a saxophonist. I played the flute at one time also. But since I got the computer and started writing on the computer, the flute stays in the case.
And what do you like about the saxophone?
Well, I fell in love with the saxophone as a youngster. My father and mother were musically inclined. My father played the clarinet here in the Quaker City Elks band. My mother was in the marching club with the Elks, and she sang in the church choir. So we were privy to have all kinds of recordings in our home. And in fact, that's what interested me was the alto saxophone, because I had heard a man named Benny Carter and Johnny Hodges, who were the foremost alto players. And Jimmy Dorsey was also in that group, and later Charlie Parker.
When did you first pick one up and start playing it?
I started playing when my father sent me the saxophone. I was going to high school in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he sent me the alto saxophone one Christmas. It took him a couple of years to pay for it. It only cost $125, but that was very 1941 or something like that. He bought it here in Philadelphia at a place called Ted Burke's on Broad Street. And he sent me the saxophone to North Carolina. And I proceeded to take some of the keys off, being an inquisitive young person, and lay them on the side. And I'd pick them and put them back on. I didn't take them all off and lay them there because I'd have never got it back together. But having heard these giants of the music swing and the jazz era, I fell in love with the alto saxophone.
Do you still have it?
Not that one. When I went to Paris in 1948, I traded that one in. I took it to the Selmer factory, Henri Selmer, as he was called, and I had a Kahn saxophone, which was an American-made. But the Henri Selmer is the most renowned saxophone people in the world. So I took it there, and they proceeded to take it and look at it and say, put it over there, and gave me a Selmer.
For free?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I'm an American artist. They treat you differently in Europe, you know. If you're coming to Europe, bringing the music of America, not their music back to them, Western classical music, but this is a creation of the American people.
What's a good saxophone? What does it take to make a good saxophone? And could you tell the difference between the Selmer and the Kahn?
Well, the Kahn spoke to me very clearly, but the Selmer projects to the audience better. That's the quality of the Selmer saxophone above all others. They've come up with a lot of new ones now, but I still have a soprano Selmer, I have an alto Selmer, I have two tenors. They're all Selmers.
Do you have a preference, alto, tenor, soprano?
Well, I'm basically tenor and soprano now. And once in a while, I'll pick up the alto. That was my first instrument, but I left that to go to the tenor. You know, it seems that in the in the 40s. The fourth instrument hired was the tenor saxophone, not a trombone, not a trumpet. After your rhythm section, the bass, drums, and piano, then the tenor was in vogue, and it still is. I think it's more a masculine sound than the soprano's, a little thin, and
When did you decide you were pretty good?
Well, I went to Paris in 1948 on a tour with the Grand Coleman Hawkins, as he was known. And I was with a group called the Sextet de Bebop. And that was Howard McGee, a trumpeter. And my brother Percy was playing the bass. And a drummer from here who passed away kind of young named Specs Wright. And, that was a pretty important time. I probably didn't sound as mature as I do now because I was very nervous when they opened the curtains at Theatre Maroney on the Champs-Élysées. And my first time ever on an airplane and going to Paris, I was pretty nervous. So I probably had a big, wide vibrato. I was like crying.
Well, how were European audiences compared to American audiences at the time?
Well, it was very different because the group that went on before us were French. And the people whistled and screamed. And I said, oh my God, there's no sense of us going out there because these guys are great. They said, no, monsieur, when they whistle, it's no good. So they were waiting for us.
Well, how popular was jazz in the States at the time? And this was right after World War II?
Yes, it was, right after World War. But jazz was always popular in the big band context during the 30s and 40s. Not that I was in it, I heard it, because my parents had those recordings in the house. Fletcher Henderson or Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey. I heard them at the Earl Theater here in Philadelphia.
You also say in your book you saw Duke Ellington when you were 6 years old.
Yeah, he didn't know me, and somebody said last night. But he just rubbed me on my head and said, Sonny, oh, how you doing, Sonny? It's not personal. It was just a meeting.
You mentioned two terms, bebop and big band, and then there's modern jazz. Can you explain the difference between them?
Well, bebop is modern jazz. It had different terms. The media puts these terms on it. It's all jazz, and it's developed into certain styles over the years. It's evolved. So from the swing era, with the big bands, like Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Lunsford and other people, Duke Ellington, that was a one way of playing. It didn't emphasize the individual soloists as much as the bebop generation. The music was a little eclectic and it wasn't as danceable. And that wasn't really the right thing to do in retrospect. But it was more concertized in the bebop era because Dizzy and Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, who created that style, they were in a small group context. They had all come through the big band era,
So with big band people danced and with bebop people sat and listened?
Yeah, that was the difference.
How big were the bands?
Well, the bands were 16 pieces usually. You had a trombone section, a trumpet section, and a saxophone section, and a rhythm section. And that's what constitutes a big band or a jazz orchestra.
You played off sheet music?
Oh, yes.
Did you improvise at all?
Yes, but the improvisation was limited because of the ensemble work of the big band. We wouldn't have 15 people sitting there while one person solos for 10 minutes, So it was a limiting but rewarding experience to be in a big band because it learns you how to play together in a section. The saxophone section had its function, the trombone section, each section had their function. The rhythm section is to keep it swinging. So, it was an experience that never can be repeated without the big band. You see, Brian, our big band is the same as the symphony orchestra. That is our largest ensemble. You know, you have all the violins, violas, cello, and all that stuff in the symphony. Well, we have that within the context of that ensemble that I mentioned, the big band. And I always say that, you know, if we wanted one person to solo, or two, or three, or up to 6 sextet, 10-tet, you can take it out of the big band, but you can't do the opposite.
Well, in a performance like that, when there's 16 musicians or so, and there's somebody up front conducting, does the band need the conductor up there, or is that mostly for show?
Well, both. They need them if it's tempo changes. They need them if it's for the endings, the cutoff points. So, you know, you need them, but it's a lot of show.
Did you perform with singers very much?
I performed with Sarah Vaughan once in Europe, and not many singers. You know, back in my time, the band was the feature. The singers was also an addition or icing on the cake. And then somewhere along the way, the singers took over. And then we all were relegated to playing backgrounds for the singers. And that happened during the big band era, I guess. Maybe Sinatra, people like that. You know, he was so powerful. But they used to come up and sing a couple of songs. And then the band would play before they came up and after. So it changed along the way. Now the singers are everything.
Do you remember the first time you got paid to play music?
Yeah. I probably played here in Philadelphia and made $1.75. But I mean, this is the 40s. People on 9 to 5 jobs weren't making $60 or $70 a week.
What was the gig?
Well, you know, there were several like that, you know. But I went on the road with a band out in Philadelphia here called Calvin Todd. And we bought a school bus and went down south on a tour. And that was quite interesting.
I want to read from your book where you talk about that. You say, in 1945, the Calvin Todd Band booked a southern tour, a real starvation tour, where we ate potted ham and crackers just to survive the gig. We bought a bus and began playing gigs that paid $2 or $4. We even paid gigs for 90 cents, or we would get a percentage.
That's true. That's the story. It was very adventurous, to say the least. I mean, we played music. And that's always been not a guaranteed situation to be a musical person.
Did you ever have a regular job?
Yeah. I've had to have regular jobs on occasions. And I worked at Macy's in New York. They had a law that if you were a musician, you had to wait 6 months before you could get the union card over there. And during that 6 months, you had to, you know, we had to survive, so we did other kinds of work. I worked catering jobs with my brother-in-law, who was a caterer, waiting tables and stuff like that.
What was a road trip like that, the Starvation Tour? What was it like? A different town every night?
Yeah, it was very, very social, because everybody's on the bus, and we all laughing and talking all day, and you know, when we get to the gig, then we got to play. But it's a great feeling to be on the road in that kind of situation. And from the Calvin Todd Band, I went into a band from Omaha, Nebraska, Nat Towles, Towles. And that was a better situation, $15 a night.
Well, were you recruited, or did you go looking for another band to play in?
Well, that one of my friends here from Philadelphia named Felix Leach, a trombonist, he said the band needed an alto saxophonist. And myself and another person tried out for the band. And there was a guy named Billy Mitchell, who's also mentioned in the book, from Detroit. And Billy ended up playing with Basie and Dizzy's bands. But Billy was in that band, in Nat Towles' band, and he was like the straw boss or the next to the boss of the band. And he had a room that had a little bed in it. And he convinced the band leader, Nat, to hire me. I couldn't read as good as the other guy, but he convinced him to hire me because he had this little bed in his room, and I could be his buddy there. So I owe Billy Mitchell that. And eventually I got to be a bigger name probably than him. And he always said, look at the little guy, look what the little guy did. You know, it was just, you know, every music, as anything in life, Brian, is up to your connections. And connections are very important. And that was one of the connections I made with Billy Mitchell, who was from my same year also. He's 1926. Coltrane and Miles and all of us from that year, Tony Bennett. And
Born the same year?
Yeah, 1926. And, you know, Billy Mitchell and I became really close friends. And by knowing him, I was able to get in that band. And that was the beginning of my career with the big band and my writing music, because I took notice of all the arrangements that we were playing, beside the stock arrangement that you could buy for $1. You could buy, I remember, Laura, da 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 da, buy arrangement on Laura for a big band for $75 or $1. So then there were people who were writing special arrangements, original stuff. And that's where I took notice of the writing and begun to write. And in fact, there was a guy named Frank Greer that had been in that band who nobody's ever heard of. And Neil Hefti, who ended up writing for Woody Herman, Count Basie, and all that, was living, I think he maybe been born in Omaha, where the band was headquartered. And he would go on the bus for nothing and travel when we go around the Midwest and all the states just to check out Frank Greer's writing. And Neil Hefti got to be a big name. So that was a connection he made that was very productive in his life.
Do you still write now?
Oh, I write all the time.
How do you write?
Well, I write on the computer now.
How do you do that?
Well, there's a program called Finale that I got, when I started teaching at Queens College in 1986 or 87. And I found I could get this Mac computer real cheap, SE, which was like looking at a postcard. The screen was so small. But the Finale program was available with a bunch of manuals that thick. And I learned how to write in this Finale. Now it's updated every year. I have now Finale 2010 upgrades every year. See, they keep you buying. But it is a program that you can use to edit. And I always wonder, and I'm amazed at people like Duke Ellington, who didn't have the computer, and they were able to write such great arrangements. However, Clark Terry, who a friend of mine, who was playing with Duke, said that Duke would bring in these arrangements and play them, and then he wouldn't like it. Say, pass that back in, and he'd tear it up. But with the computer, Brian, you can edit. If you have a counterpoint line that you got your melody line, then you write a counter line. And if you don't like it, you say delete. And you put in another line till you find one you like. And then when you get the breath of life with the people playing, after you get it written and take it into the band, then it comes to life. The computer writing music, you got the symphonic programs, you got all these programs, jazz band programs. But, you know, it sounds like a glorified accordion when you play it back at home. But when you get to the people playing it, then it sounds like real music.
Does it ever sound different than you expected it to sound when the musicians play it?
It always sounds different. sounds better. That's the advantage of having a computer. It's an editing device.
Did you compose before you had a computer?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Well, it was tedious, and you had to write the music by hand, and, you know, and you had to take it in to somebody and approve of it. Also, you know, it took longer. You know, if you played something on your saxophone and you like that melody, and then you write that melody out, then you have to write a counter line to that melody. So if the melody's in the saxophone section, and then your counter line's in the brass section, you got to write all of that down. And you got to make sure you got everything correct there. You write in concert key. That's in the piano key. But the computer, I can write it in concert key and push buttons and transpose it to each instrument. So it's an advantage of having a computer.
When you composed before you had a computer, did you have your sax in your hand to play along as you wrote it?
No, the piano. See, when I left Nat Toll's band and came back to Philadelphia, I met Dizzy Gillespie. He came here, played at the Elate's Ballroom, I think it is, Broad and Fitzwater. And I went to hear the band. And my mother would always tell us, because there's 3 musicians in the family. My brother Percy played the bass, and my brother Tootie played the drums, Albert. So we were privy to have the option of bringing the band members who we liked to the house, and my mother would cook some food for them. So Dizzy came to my house, and he said, if you're going to write music, you got to learn keyboard. You got to learn the piano. So I proceeded to learn the piano, and I'm on the piano practically every day, as well as the saxophone and the computer. So it's a combination now of things.
Where'd you live in Philly?
I lived on, I was born in West Philly, 5710 Ludlow Street, in the house. I was in a hurry to get here. I jumped out in the house. My grandmother was a midwife. And we lived in several small streets in South Philly after we moved from West Philly. Garnett Street, Garrett Street. And then we eventually moved to Federal Street and bought a house, my father and us together bought a house on 1927 Federal. And that house is still there. I pass it for nostalgic reasons sometimes just to look at it.
You played in a band with your 2 brothers. That was after you had started as a professional?
Well, my brother Percy had started as a violinist.
He's older than you?
Yes, he's about 3 years older than me. Passed away in 2005. He was the one who had the reputation as being a performer with the Modern Jazz Quartet, which was had huge popularity, especially in Europe and around the world. But he started on violin, and my father offered each child their choice of instrument. I had a sister who was older than Percy, and she started to play the piano and took a few lessons until she met boys, and that was the end of her pianist career. And then Percy the violin, and then me the saxophone, and my younger brother went to school here in Philly, and he started out with a trombone. He said he put that down. He wanted to play drums from the beginning, but somebody already was on the drums. So he took the trombone. And eventually he said there was too much spit coming out of that. He didn't like it. So he gave that up, and now he's a drummer. And, the family was music-oriented.
Did you play together as a band when you were younger?
Not really young. Me and Percy did. We went to Paris. Percy was with me when we went to Paris with Howard McGee in 1948. But Tootie was 9 years younger, so he didn't come along to play with the Heath brothers. Much later, we got together as a family.
How'd you get along, 3 brothers playing in the same band?
Well, we argued like all brothers, but we had some sibling rivalry, too, not just all rivalry.
Was one of you the boss?
Well, my brother, the older Percy, he tried to be boss. I always tell him, Brian, say, wait a minute. You are Percy Jr. You are not my father. My father's senior. So you stop telling me what to do.
Now, your book is called I Walked with Giants. First of all, why did you decide to do an autobiography?
Well, I really wanted to leave my story here because I had a up and down story in life that I wanted to tell, the good things that happened to me and all of the accolades and awards that I've received, and the bad part of being a drug addict and going to prison. I got arrested here for, selling heroin, because I was an addict, and that's what they call an addict peddler, because I wasn't making money off drugs. I was just turning it into more for myself. If I sell some to you, then I can get 2 bags for myself. So, and I got in some serious trouble doing that, and they put me in Lewisburg Penitentiary, the federal government. I remember the judge's name was Judge Lord, and I wasn't never religious. My mother was, but I prayed. I said, oh my God, Judge Lord. And Judge Lord sentenced me to 6 years on the first count, 6 years on the second count, 6 years on the third count, 6 years on the fourth count, 6 years on the fifth count, and he said to run consecutively or concurrently, not consecutively. I would have been in 36 years. That's my slip there. And then he said, on the sixth count, I impose a $100 fine. So that meant concurrently, I only did 4 years and 5 months in Lewisburg. But a lot of good things happened.
What good happened in prison?
Well, the man named, he came into the prison. I had the band because I was a professional already before I went.
You had a band in prison?
Bruce Lundvall, yeah, came into the prison. He was going to Bucknell College. He ended up being the president of the jazz division of Columbia Records. And in 1978 or something, after I came home in 59 and changed my life completely around, I signed up, the Heath brothers, we signed up with Columbia Records, which is the biggest record company at that time in the world. And he had come to Lewisburg to hear me perform there, having heard me play with Miles Davis in 53 on recordings before I went away in 55. So that's one good thing that came from it. The other good thing is it taught me a hell of a lesson to never use drugs again. And I've been home from prison since 59, and I never went that way again.
How'd you get involved in heroin in the first place?
Well, it was so readily available. I really got into heroin because of having my pianist take my girlfriend away from me. And I had intended, we were engaged to get married, and we had a son. And I helped him to get with Dizzy's band. And next thing I know, she was in New York hanging out with him. And I said, oh my God. And I was on a down from romance. And this drummer that was with Dizzy, named Teddy Stewart from Kansas City, Teddy said, man, I got something to give you a lift. And he put this heroin and I snorted in my nose. And that was something I should have never done. It took me all 6 or 7 years, including the 4.5 in prison, to get rid of that habit that I got into.
Did I read this right, that you got fired from Dizzy Gillespie's band because of
Yeah,
drugs?
well, that was, we all were in the club at Silhouette in Chicago with Dizzy. And Coltrane and Specs Wright, the drummer I was talking about, and myself were down in the basement doing intermission. And I forgot, I think maybe it's Coltrane or Specs, one of us was down there shooting up. And Dizzy came down because it was time for us to get back on the stage. And he said, all of you MFs are fired. and he fired us. But Coltrane seemed to beg his way back in because he had stopped and he was just drinking a lot. And he stayed a little longer than I did. I got fired, and Specs Wright, we got fired. And that's when I came back to Philly and started playing the tenor saxophone.
And when you got out of prison, was it hard to get back into the music scene, and had music changed at all while you were in?
Yes, music had changed. I joined Miles because Coltrane had left Miles then in '59, and Miles got me back, having recorded with him in '53. He got me back. So I flew out to California and joined his band, and he was playing in a modal fashion, which was different than the way we had been playing before I went away. And it took me a while to get used to it, but I was so unfortunate that the probation officer, Mr. Marrow, he says, well, we were coming back from L.A. and going to Chicago to play the festival, Playboy Festival or something. And he says, well, when you come home, just report back in. So when I came back to Philly and reported back to him, he said, I got orders that you should stay within a 90-mile radius of Philadelphia. And he grounded me. And Miles tried his best to get me back on the road. And they wouldn't hear it at all. He knew some people, and he was trying to pull strings, but I had to serve the rest of my, what they call conditional release, not parole. You get parole before you're sentenced, but after you get sentenced, they call it conditional release. And I had this tag on me, so I had to get permission from the probation officer when I wanted to go to New York to record. And 24 hour, I wrote a composition called 24-Hour Leave, because they allowed me to go to New York and record because I had signed a record contract. And I would come back to Philly in 24 hours after I recorded. But after the probational conditional release was over, then I was, so-called free, but the stigma of being a drug addict, and it hangs on you for a long time.
I want to read you something out of you mentioned playing in modal, and you have a scene here where you're talking to, I guess, Miles Davis, and you're talking about the Dorian mode, and he says, as part of it, you write, the other chords on the top could be anything on the white keys, a D minor chord, an F Lydian, a G dominant seventh, an A minor seventh, or a B diminished seventh, all in the key of C. How did you learn all that music theory, and is it necessary to play jazz?
Oh, yeah. Sure. You got to learn everything. To be a composer and an improviser, you have lots of material. The only thing different in Western classical studies is the fact that they memorize long concertos and everything. But we memorize hundreds of songs. I can play the chords and harmonies to over 200 or 300 songs on the piano. So we have to absorb all of that, the same as Western classical musicians.
Do you remember everything you've written? If you heard a tune
No.
that you wrote years ago, would you recognize it?
No, I got about 150 compositions. I can't remember them all. It would take me a while, but they would come back. But then I started writing extended works, longer pieces, suites and things like that. And I studied some more to be able to do that. I studied from a man from Leipzig, Germany, named Professor Rudolf Schramm, who taught at NYU in New York. I studied from him privately. Now, his claim to fame is that he was a musical director for Eleanor Roosevelt's radio show or something. And his wife was a ballet dancer, and she came over here from Germany. And Professor Schramm had a system called a Schillinger system, which is a number system. I think Gershwin studied Schillinger, and a lot of other people who you know. And I studied that system too. He taught it at NYU. And that kind of added to what I had already learned. When I went to SRAM, I had already written for recordings and all that. and for different size ensembles. But this just gave me more insight into string writing and choir and different forms and different ensembles. So it was 2 years of a great experience, and he really liked me. He said I was a hard worker.
You said at the start of this conversation that you have done some teaching at Queens College.
Yeah.
How do you teach?
Aaron Copeland School of Music. I taught there 10 years. Well, the same thing I just got through telling you. Well, everybody, when they come, this was a master's degree program. So all of the students come from around the world. They already have a bachelor's degree. So they've been through the rudiments and the exercises of being able to read music and all of that. Now you have to create your own music.
So you taught composition?
Oh,
Teach
yeah.
composition?
I taught composition and saxophone at Queens College. Composition, I taught some of the principles that I learned from the Schillinger system, from traditional harmony, and over a period of time, I had acquired a lot of knowledge about writing. I was around, mentors who wrote for the big bands, and I would always ask questions, and people were very good about if you were interested in something that they like if somebody asked me something now, I give it to them, so it's a continuum, and it's the connections that I've been talking about over and over, connections that people like Gil Fuller, he studied Schillinger too, and he was the orchestrator for Dizzy Gillespie's band, and I studied some from him, and he would show me things. Tad Dameron, these are people that were writing for Dizzy Gillespie's band. George Russell was another guy who had a system, Lydian concept of tonal organization. He taught at UMass, New England Conservatory. So, it's a matter of studying, and it's a matter of being around those people who would show you things, mentors, and making that connection. And consequently, I became an orchestrator. I wrote one symphonic work. It's titled 3 Ears. And it was commissioned by Queens College when I got there. And they paid me on the commission $3,000. It cost more than that to get it copied. Because it was a labor of love. So I had this one section, 3 ears. I say, you hear music with 3 ears. You hear it with your mind, you hear it with your heart, and some people hear music with their body. So these are the 3 ears. The body's ear, the mind's ear, and the heart's ear. So that's why I call this piece 3 Ears. And it was performed twice. It was performed when I first wrote it. And that wasn't quite as successful as when I became 80 years old. They redid it at Queens College.
Do you remember what your best payday was as a musician?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes you make $8,000-$10,000. That's pretty good.
For one concert?
Yeah, but that's a group,
And divided up?
It's not like Miles. Miles was a high-paid jazz person. I think he probably made more money than Dizzy Gillespie did. Oscar Peterson used to make $10,000 a concert doing solo piano. But this is not in the ball game with your popular music.
Do you remember a particular concert where you were up on stage performing and just thought, man, we've really got it tonight. Things are really clicking.
Yeah, sometimes you hit that special moment of groove and you get everything right. And other times you use your professionalism to get by. You do pretty good. I mean, there's a certain level we always maintain because we've done so much homework, practice all the time. But there's certain periods when you get a climax that is surprising to you. It just comes. And, you know, improvisation is the ability to stand on your feet and create music, ideas that would come, and climax that the audience can feel. You know, I want to give you an example of what I witnessed. It was on a concert for Ella Fitzgerald at Lincoln Center when David Dinkins was the mayor of New York. And there were all kinds of personalities there. But this one thing was Itzhak Perlman and Oscar Peterson. And of course, they played Gershwin's Summertime, and Itzhak played it just beautiful, the melody. And after he played the melody, Oscar Peterson continued to improvise and create his own ideas and build and build. And Itzhak was looking at him like, because he didn't improvise. This is a great music style that is American. It is the most democratic music, Brian, that's ever been created, because everybody in the group is allowed to speak their piece musically and tell their story. That's why, you know, it's difficult for audiences who are not musically trained as European audiences or Japanese audiences. America's musical training in schools is lacking.
Well, if someone's watching this and they really don't know a whole lot about jazz, how should they start if they want to learn more?
Well, they just get some records, because it's very difficult to not have a historic background. They should start out by listening to Louis Armstrong and people from the New Orleans early jazz, Jelly Roll Morton and people like that, and Sidney Bechet, who was very famous in Paris. They got statues over there for, and he's from New Orleans, a soprano saxophone player. And you know, when you see books in Europe written about jazz, and you don't see a lot of them here, that was what prompted me. But there are a lot of exercise books and a lot of books being written now. But the schools the training is lacking.
What are the recordings of yours that people should listen to?
Well, if they like big band music and they could get it, Bill Cosby produced the one called Little Man Big Band about 10, 15 years ago on Verve Records, and it was nominated for Grammy, and that's a big band context. Now we have Heath Brothers, we have small group things. I also have another big band record a few years ago called Turn Up the Heath. Small group, we had the Heath Brothers. I have records on my own name, on Steeplechase label from Europe, Denmark. The last one we have, it just came out last year, it's called Endurance. It's with me and my brother, Tootie on the drums, Albert, and it's dedicated to Percy, who passed 2005, my brother, and that's a quartet record. And, you know, I think if people would listen to those recordings, they would learn what the evolution is about and what the music means, you know, because in schools they'll bring a string quartet in for you to hear, and you'll understand how to listen to Western classical music, but they don't do that with the Afro-American classical music.
You mentioned Bill Cosby, and he wrote the foreword for this book. How'd that come about? How'd you get to know him?
Well, Bill it was a place down at Broad Pine or no, maybe Broad Locust or Spruce, called the Underground. And Bill, I think, was just getting out of Temple. And they had 3 different rooms in this venue, and one was where the jazz was being played, and one was where they had some girls dancing or something, and then they had a bar, and Cosby was telling jokes across the bar. I think he was bartending. And I had the gig in the big jazz room. And I always tell Bill, I say, you know, I had the gig when you took across the bar. He said, yeah, but I got the gig now. I said, you're right. Because he had me on his show. He just had me to perform with him at the Mark Twain Award for Comedy that Bill got about 2 months ago at the Kennedy Center. And besides the comedians that were there, Seinfeld, Chris Rock, and others, Dick Gregory and other comedians, he had me to play. And it was very, very nice. He's had me on the show, and, you know, I've opened for him in different venues, like in California. And before, when he was on, right after I Spy, before he got the Cosby Show. Then I played on the Cosby Show a couple of times. So we've been friends a long time. Last week I played at the Blue Note in New York with my big band. And Cosby, of course, came the opening night. And it was my wife and I's golden wedding anniversary that week. And he bought 100 roses. I've never seen, I could hardly carry them. 50 apiece for me and my wife, Mona.
Tell me about your wife.
Well, we got married, 6 months or more. Let me see. I got out of prison on May 21st of 1959, and my brother, Percy, introduced me to my wife, Mona, who was a jazz fan, and she was an artist from University of Pennsylvania, most creative in her class of 56. And we struck it right away, and we got married February the 4th of 1960. So that's exactly 50 years ago.
And it's an interracial marriage.
Yes, it is.
How did her family
Before
feel about
Obama, I would say.
How did her family feel about that?
Well, they didn't feel too good about it. Her father was Canadian, and her mother was from New Jersey. And her mother really went along with her father. Whatever he said was the law. And I never met this man. But after he passed away, me and Mom got to be really great friends, and she admired me. And she used to brag, oh, my daughter Mona married a college professor, not the music, but the college professor part she liked. And Mom Alice was a wonderful lady. We had a great time until she passed. She was about 91 or something when she passed.
How'd your family react to the marriage?
Oh, we lived in my mother and father's home on Federal Street until we were able to move to New York and get our own place. So they went along with it, because my brother Percy had been married interracially too. And he stayed married 50, maybe more, 55 years before he passed. So we have a history of staying.
And you and Mona have a daughter?
We have a daughter and a son. We have a daughter who's, what does she call her? She got such a long title. I call her lab supervisor, director of the lab or something, executive director of the lab in the DeKalb County Medical Center. They call it DeKalb because it's in Atlanta. They leave the L out. DeKalb, we call it. DeKalb County Medical Center. I say, girl, you're talking mighty country since you moved to Atlanta. But she's doing quite well.
And your son?
Well, he's back home with us. And he works. And he's a hobby king. He works in a hobby shop. And he tries everything they make. It's pretty good that his mom's good looking and his daddy's rich. Hush, little baby, don't you cry. But he's 6'2" and 220 or something like that, big guy. And he's he's a nice kid. He never got in any trouble. And he just went out to Utah or something, went snowboarding.
And you mentioned earlier your son Mtume?
Mtume, yeah.
Mtume. He's a musician also?
Yeah, Mtume is the big star of the family. He wrote for Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway a song called The Closer I Get to You, which was #2 in the world under the Bee Gees, Staying Alive. The closer I get to you, the way you make me feel, over and over again. You never heard that?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big hit.
Yeah.
Then he had others. He's got about 4 or 5 gold records. Stephanie Mills. Oh, I never had love like this before. He's a songwriter. And he's on the air in New York now, on the radio every Sunday doing a show called Open Line.
Getting back to your recordings, when did you start doing recordings? And
The first under my name was in 1959. After I got home, I signed with Riverside Records. But I had recorded with Miles and people before I went away. I recorded in Paris with Howard McGee in 1948 in May when we went. And on that, I played about 8 bars, I Surrender Dear, on a record that is Earl Garner on the piano. So I had my first recording, I guess, was 1948 with other people. You know, I had recorded with Dizzy and his band, but my own record under my name was 59. And since that time, I've been on, I guess I made about 6 or 7 albums with Riverside. And then I got with CBS, and we did 3 or 4 with CBS, and I've been with other labels, you know, since then. And the latest is a Jazz Legacy Productions. It's called Endurance.
any of them sell very well?
I think the biggest sellers were with CBS Records with Columbia.
What's a recording session like for you?
Well, a recording session for a jazz musician is entirely different than the manufactured music of the so-called popular music. They go in the studio and put the rhythm tracks down, and maybe 2 weeks later they'll come back and put the background track, and then the artist comes in and sings on top, and it's all on top of a recording. Where in jazz recordings, like you go in the studio and you may make a whole album, 60 minutes of music in one day. Because you know what you're doing when you get there, and you're not stacking up one idea on top of the other. It's like manufactured music, you know.
Did you improvising while you're recording?
You got to. That's part of our genre. We have to improvise or it's not jazz.
Is it a problem if you do an improvisation during a recording that sort of becomes part of the thing, part of the song, as opposed to an improvisation?
Yeah, well, that has become a problem with some big hit records, like Flying Home by Lionel Hampton. The saxophone solo would have to be repeated, you know, and then you could change, but you were stuck with that solo that you put on the record if people get so they like. And then there were people who come up with this jazz vocalizing where they would put words to your solo if it was a big hit record, like James Moody with Moody's Mood for Love. And so he has to sing that same melody all the time.
Are you a better musician now than you were years ago?
Definitely. I've been working on it for 50, 60 years. Come on. And I'm at it every day, Brian.
How much do you practice?
I practice every day. Maybe some days I miss. I'm on the piano doing some, or writing on the computer. But music is every day. 24/7, I'm into music. So I know I'm better at it than I was. Whether the people understand it or not, that's another story. I'm not going to go too far out of the tonality.
How do you practice? I mean, when you start at the beginning of the day, you pick up your sax.
Well, I keep them on a stand ready all the time. When I think of something, I pick it up and practice. You practice your tone, long tones. You practice sequences, chord sequences, changes. You practice the different songs that you have to play because they each have a different chord structure. Like if I was playing a standard song, like Jerome Kern's All the Things You Are. I've played that song many years. Some people have transcribed my solos and written them out. But if you play a composition that you really know, you can create differently every time you play it because you know it so well. Well, I tried this the last time. Let me try something else. And you develop a certain level of improvisation that gets higher and higher level. And you could do what you want. You, spur of the moment, you hear the piano player do something and you pick up on what he does. You have your ears open as an improvising musician. And we play off of each other. If he said dun 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 dun, and I said ba 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 dun dun dun, I catch up with what he's playing.
How do you keep from falling into a rut and sort of doing the same type of little things in your improvisation?
Well, everybody has cliches that they refer to. As you have those in your data bank, and you refer to them. Everybody has, but you try your best not to repeat yourself. You know, the great improvisers were the people who didn't repeat themselves much.
And the same thing with your composing. Do you ever sit down and write something and you're almost finished and you think, oh, wait, this is just like something I wrote 5 years ago?
Yeah, and then you have to, well, over a period of years, you learn how to change a note here or there and make it a different song. You change the rhythm of it or the notes themselves, you know, because after all of the music of Bach, Beethoven, or whoever, Stravinsky, and all of the jazz music that's been written for all these years, we all use the same chromatic 12-tone scale. And how you can come up with a different song out of that, it amazes me, but people do every day.
How often do you perform now?
Well, I'm performing quite a bit this year. I'm going out to Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm going to San Francisco 11th and 12th, 13th, 14th of March. And I'm going to Europe in June, to Holland, to play with their big band in The Hague. Benny Golson and myself. Benny's a Philadelphia saxophonist who happened to play in my band back in the day, he and Coltrane. And Benny's a great orchestrator and composer, and they're going to have us both on this program, maybe an hour of each of us with a big band over there. They have big bands in Europe that are radio bands that have been going on for years. You know, we don't have them here like we should in America where the music was created, but they do, you know.
What has kept it new and fresh for you for so many years?
Well, I'm always learning new things. You know, music is forever. It was here when we came here and be here when we die and we're gone. And it behooves me to try to create something different and add my take on whatever I play. And, you know, once you achieve a certain sound that's individual and people can recognize you, then you got it made. Like if Stan Getz plays on a record, I know him. I can tell. If Dizzy plays on a record, I know him. He's got a sound. If Coltrane plays on a record, I know that sound. And once you get an identity, then people look for your next offering.
We are out of time. We've been talking to Jimmy Heath. He is the author of his autobiography, I Walked with Giants. Jimmy Heath, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.